In this new lecture on French astrology, I would like to speak on a specific debate about prediction and astropsychology. Many astrologers today are content or satisfied by limitating themselves to the study of the natal chart and the study of the transits at the time of the consultation, which is a sort of horary astrology, which was more or less in the idea of Morin de Villefranche-Morinus, who said in the middle of the 17th century that one cannot study horary astrology without referring to the natal chart, which was not necessarily the case of William Lilly in his Christian astrology, who advocated the use of the horary chart without necessarily referring to the natal chart. And this way of working is not very satisfactory, not very satisfying in many ways. Because in fact, astrology has a lot to do with changes, with periods, with cycles. And he's not so much interested, I think, in what has been done at a certain moment. What has been done at a certain moment is not necessarily influential for what will happen in the later periods. So it is exaggerated in France to insist so much on the importance of the natal chart at the expenses of any other serious research. Because, in fact, most astrologers today can only work on the immediate questions which are coming to the person. Even when they use the natal chart, they use it as an horary chart. That is, they expect to find in the natal chart what is happening now at the moment of the consultation. And obviously, if they would use this natal chart at another moment, they will see in the natal chart something else. There's also the lack of interest of biographical historical studies, where you just try to find in the natal chart what you know about the life of a person. So, in France, at least in France, maybe somewhere else, I suppose, in France, most astrologers oppose the psychology which would be static to the events which are by definition something which changes. But in reality, it's not how should things be presented. In reality, psychology is supposed to change. At least astrological psychology is supposed to change. And the person will change in her behavior according to the different stages of the different cycles. And the notion of astrological portrait as a sort of basic presentation which will be true through the whole life is something rather artificial and not really appropriate. What you see in the chart in any case, is a combination of all sorts of positions, which in the best case will not work at the same time. And the astrologer will have to explain when such and such potentiality will occur, will express itself. And generally they do not do that work. And in general also, even when they study biographies, they do not take the time to collect all the data, all the chronological data, and also all the astronomical data. So astrologers are becoming very lazy in their way of working, and the solutions they have found are not really acceptable. So the question is also, what does astrology predict? And as a matter of fact, French astrologers do not like the word predict. They prefer the word prevision, as if prevision was not so divinatory than prediction. Well, it's a matter of words. I would say that astrology, as I consider it, is concerned by the study of risks. A prophet, like Jonas in the Bible, is announcing something which will occur, which has quite possibilities of occurring if certain conditions are not filled and respected. So one can predict a risk of something. It doesn't mean that this risk will really be unattended, that the risk will really produce final effects. No, not necessarily. But it's not because something aborts, it doesn't exist. An operation which aborts is an operation which has existed, which had at least a beginning of existence. Imagine, for example, what happened in 2011. Could have aborted, maybe, but it would have existed. The preparation would have existed, but it would not have necessarily brought the results we know. So astrologers should not limit themselves to the fact that something really happened or not, because preparation in itself is already an event. Like you abort from a birth. Abort means that something has been stopped, has been interrupted. But this interruption is also to be studied and analyzed. And that is why I think that astrology is concerned by the risks of something to happen, to occur. And it needs a certain precision in the study, on the chronological study. In many cases, the chronology does not mention what has aborted, does not mention a revolution which has aborted, doesn't mention an election which has aborted. The life of someone sometimes, someone who fails to be elected, has still lived a certain experience of tending to be elected, trying to be elected, and this attempt has to be studied and announced by astrology. The risk is, therefore, a very good definition of what astrology is about in terms of prediction. Astrology can mention a risk and can also, in a certain way, can also permit to avoid that risk or to limit the effects of the risk. But sometimes the risk is necessary. Sometimes we need to take a risk to achieve certain things, but doesn't mean you have to pay a too high price for that. So limiting the risk is the best thing to do. It doesn't mean you have to suppress any sort of risk, but you have to avoid the extreme effects and results of the risk. As you probably know, if you hear what I say in my different lectures, the astrocycling that I have developed is about risks, about temptation, about attempts to do certain things. For instance, today we speak of possibility of merging, of fusion between societies, enterprises. Certain enterprises will merge, and that might produce certain unemployment. And we have to accept the idea that at a certain time unemployment is an issue, is a necessity. Because at this time the risk is, of course, unemployment. Someone will be unemployed, will retire, will not be able to continue in his activity. Right. But on the other hand, there are other periods where a great need of people, of employees, is necessary. So the situation is not necessarily always the same. The needs of the society in terms of employment are not necessarily always the same. And societies have to organize themselves to manage this succession of periods which have contradictory, opposite profiles. And if possible, thanks to astrology, thanks to the astrology I've developed, it is possible to act as wisely as possible in these fields. Because you know what's going to happen, you know what are the risks, you know that if you don't do it properly, the consequences will be dramatic and excessive. And on the other hand, if you do it properly, the results will be acceptable and tolerable, if not necessarily totally pleasant. So, astrology, and I will finish with this consideration, I suppose, astrology has to find its specific approach. Why people want their natal chart is also a question. What for? And do we have to accept this expectation from the public? I want my chart. I want my chart. I want to see my chart. I believe that in a certain way this is a pathological expectation, a sort of chimera of dream of being able to visualize yourself, your soul, through the chart, through the natal chart, which is something constant, which is a paradox, because astrology has not to do with constant things. It has to do with changes, and does not to do so much in individualities, in personalities, but in global changes, in global psychology, psychology of the crowd, psychology of women in general, not of a personal case. Astrology is not made to study personal cases, although people are connected astrology with psychoanalysis. But even psychoanalysis is not necessarily something personal. It is applied to a person, but the model itself is not personal. And this is also confusion in the minds of many astrologers. The thing that if you study a person, you have to get a personal model, a personal pattern. That's what the astrology of personality of Benriga was about, more or less. I think that was a mistake. It is true, nevertheless, that some people expect that sort of data from astrology. But maybe they're wrong. Maybe it can be useful also to do it, to instrumentalize astrology for that purpose. It's a great question, the fact that sometimes we use a knowledge for something which is not relevant for that knowledge, but which still works. After all, we astrologers, we use the planets in a way which is not what the planets are dedicated to, are destined to. It can work in a way. And at the same time, you can also use astrology in a way which is not the proper way, but it can also be useful in this improper way. This is a sort of creative approach which I cannot condemn formally. I would certainly not condemn what astrology has done with astronomy, and how astrology has created some sort of new approach of the sky, which is not the approach of the astronomers. And I don't like astrologers who try too much to stick to astronomy. So in that case also, I suppose that the astrologer could use astronomy and astrology in the purpose of helping the person to feel secure about himself by showing him his chart, his astral identity. Why not? It is a sort of new form of astrology. People who have been suffering from being not enough recognized as a person, especially in their childhood, have probably a strong need for that sort of image of themselves. At the same time, they also have a strong need to believe that there is an individual soul which has an individual destiny. But they go too far when they say that, for instance, everyone has his own astrological calendar, that the transit which exist which are formed for a certain chart do not occur at the same time as the transit for another chart. This is unacceptable, and it gives sort of image of the world which is totally chaotic, as if everybody would live on his own planet in a certain way. Astrology, or on the contrary, has to tell us what we have to share, what we live synchronically, together at the same time, not at different moments. Because this phantasm of personal astrology has been developed much too far, much too extremely far, and this is quite regrettable, although it can play a role in the comfort of a person to believe that he is not, doesn't disappear in the crowd, but he exists as a person, like a child where we have many brothers and sisters, etc. I had sort of fear that he was neglected, that he was not considered properly, that people were not understanding what he was. All this leads people to believe in astrology, especially to believe not only in astrology, not in popular astrology of the 12 signs, but in a very much precise and personal astrology of the chart, of the natal chart. And this is not really the type of person and profile which I prefer about the use of astrology. But it does exist.